So today we're going to be covering a strategy for advanced argumentation that goes a little bit beyond the usual questions of why is something true, why is something good or bad, why is it important, etc. I find that breaking arguments, forms of engagement, weighing down to specifically incentive capacity analysis can be a really helpful tool, especially if you're not very familiar with the topics that you're actually debating. So the goal ideally is that if you truly understand what the incentives as well as capacities of the stakeholders in the debate that you're debating are, you can basically deliver a speech off a single sticky note. You don't have to, but it's just to really push the clarity of what your argument is about, what your case is about through. So we'll be covering 5 things. Firstly, this thing that's called the good argument matrix, essentially 4 categories within which every argument in a debate falls. Then we'll go through how to create an impact-driven case, which is going to be a very small part of the workshop, and then move on to separately incentives, capacities, and lastly, the strategic importance of doing this analysis in the first place and how to drive it further. So firstly, then, the good argument matrix. So there are 2 axes that you need to be looking into when you make an argument. The first is that of impact, as in how high is the impact of the argument that you're bringing. And the second is the likelihood. How likely is it that this argument is actually going to actualize itself in reality, in the real world, not just debate land? With this axis, we have 4 categories. The first, and the one that you should ideally be aiming for, are arguments that are highly likely and that have a high impact. The worst category, of course, is low likelihood and low impact arguments intuitively. And then you have the 2 categories where you really have to think about whether you're willing to, quote unquote, risk it. So you either have low likelihood, but really high impacts, as in it might not be very realistic that the stakeholder will be able to pull off whatever it is that they're trying to move forward. But if they do, then you definitely would win the debate. Or high likelihood, but low impact arguments, which are a lot more safe, as in for sure you're going to have some sort of a change in the world. The question is whether that sort of change is enough in order to score the debate. So, low likelihood and high impact arguments are especially useful if your opponent's mechanization is weak, as in they don't properly explain and go through why is it likely that their arguments are going to actualize themselves. Then you can sort of go on their level, argue in the same way sort of that they do, of course, trying to go through the steps of analysis that prove that there is some sort of a likelihood, but there's a higher chance that you're able to prove that the high impact is going to be just as likely, if not more likely, than your opponents. And this is also, this category is also the reason why trained, untrained team debates are usually low quality. So think of a national squad debating complete beginners, and then it seems as though the national team doesn't really pull their weight. The reason for that is because they oftentimes just assume that they don't have to go through the argumentation of why their arguments are likely, since their opponents don't. But if you're able to pull this, then of course, you can win a case with such debate, with such arguments as well. For low risk, lower reward, you're going to have to do a little bit more weighing on the impact side. Since the impact is more or less certain, you have to look at where your opponents are offering and try and argue that it's more important, that the incentives, for example, are more aligned with the impact that you're offering as opposed to what it is that your opponents are offering. So if you can't prove a super fantastic argument, you have to be strategic about whether you're willing to risk it or whether you're willing to go safe but prove less. Now, for every argument, there are 3 parts. So likelihood actually consists of these 2 subparts, which is 1, a stakeholders' incentives, that is to say, the motivation that they have to actually do something. What moves the stakeholder to act the way that you want them to? And the second subcategory is capacity, as in resources. Is the stakeholder able to achieve what you expect them to? And given the likelihood, then we can actually achieve the impact, which is something that contributes towards the shared understanding of what the ultimate goal of the debate is. So without further ado, then let's break the impact part of the debate down briefly. So this doesn't mean the impact of a specific argument. This is more so what kind of change do we want to see in the world after the debate takes place, whether it be policy or narrative or whatever else. Note that this impact is usually shared between proposition, opposition, both sides of the bench. Disagreements in debates usually are not about what is the impact that we're hoping for. They're about the pathway, the way to getting there. What is the more efficient, the more moral modus operandi? So because of this, you have to not do too much legwork, not get too much into the impact and why it is important. How do you come to the conclusion that it's important, since your opponents are likely to agree with that in the first place? Where these differences might emerge is in principled cases, especially, say, if it's not both teams trying to think about the best possible way to give a specific stakeholder, say a marginalized community agency, but if it's about whether self-expression is more important, like the right to express oneself is more important than some sort of tangible outcomes, potential policy changes. There, you really have to work for justifying the impact of your case. So this has to be established within the framing, within the first few minutes of the debate, just so that it's sort of clear for the judges and put forward. So what this could look like is if we're debating limiting tourism, this is a debate from last year's World Schools, you have to briefly ask yourself the following questions. One, who is the main stakeholder in the debate? In this case, it is likely to be countries that are heavily financially reliant on or affected by tourism. This can also be, for example, environmental impacts. If you don't know much about the tourism industry, how it plays out, the economics behind it especially, you can always humanize the debate in order to make it more intuitive. What I mean by that is that you think about the people behind the countries that are affected by or reliant on tourism. So you sketch out the characterization of a souvenir store owner, a bus operator, a mayor, a student from a low-income family, etc. And then you move your analysis forward by thinking about what these stakeholders care about. And these things can be intuitive. They usually are intuitive. To live a generally good life, to be able to sustain oneself and one's family. Both sides of the house, pro-limiting tourism, anti-limiting tourism, are going to be in support of this statement. It's the same sort of trap that decades ago debaters would fall into, assuming that if you're debating the social justice movement, one of the sides is supposed to oppose it. It's not. Both sides are supposed to come to some sort of a conclusion of what is the best way to move forward. And then lastly, this is a step that differentiates, that creates a difference between average debates and great debates. It is the meta sort of picture. It is what is the actual impact that is beyond living a generally good life, being able to provide for yourself and your family, etc. So you connect intuitive goals with more fundamental concepts, usually principles. So in this case, the debate would not just be about general well-being, but it would be about one's ability to be autonomous, one's ability to feel as if they're being respected, one's ability to maybe even affect policy in a way that prioritizes oneself as opposed to someone who comes and visits for a couple of weeks. So the C bit, you probably have to do a little bit more work on understanding principles better, how to set them up, how to justify them. So we're not going to get into this. But this is an important sort of characterization to bring at the very beginning of the debate. Now, let's move on to incentive analysis. So with incentives, the key question that you need to ask yourself is what drives your stakeholder. And I have sort of divided potential ways to answer this question into 3 separate parts with case studies that will hopefully help you understand how to actually implement this in your prep routine. So first, you need to understand what the goal of the stakeholder is. And I want to note here, this workshop is not just for agent-specific motions. It doesn't have to be a motion that states this house as country X or as movement X does something. It is more so about considering the people that are affected by or affecting, not only people, can be organizations, institutions, narratives even, that are affected by the motion, right? So you have to usually consider multiple points of view unless you're really only talking about a debate from a specific point of view. So you need to think about the goal of the stakeholder. And here we're thinking very pragmatic calculations. What is it that I want to achieve? So sure, it's the impact analysis that we talked about a little bit before, but more specifically in the context of a more narrow argument that helps us attain a broader goal, we have to think about what stands to be lost or gained as a natural consequence of the debate having taken place. So this is very easy if we're talking about policy changes. You either have a certain policy passed or it doesn't. And how does that alter the reality of the stakeholder? But it can also be more vague things or things that are a little bit more difficult to calculate, as in power in whatever context. It could be in an institutional setting framework, someone getting elected or someone being able to lobby for some sort of a goal that they see as valuable. But it can also be soft power, the capacity to lead on creating a certain narrative about your country, about your community, even about yourself as an individual. It can be things like emotional well-being, potential harm, potential vulnerability, exposure to other stakeholders that might have competing incentives. So this you have to really, really clarify for yourself once you're constructing an argument. And then the second part, to coming to terms with what the pragmatic calculations of your stakeholder is what is the context that the debate takes place in. If we're behind a sort of veil of ignorance, that doesn't really work. But if we don't think about what are the real life implications under which a stakeholder has to make a decision, our case is not going to be realistic. So this question brings the debate to a real life scenario. So where is your actor situated and how are they vulnerable? How might their incentives be competing with one another? And here is a quick sort of walkthrough of a potential scenario in a debate where we're calculating between competing incentives. So this is a sketch out of some sort of a institution, or to make it more intuitive, a company that has the choice of either implementing actual reforms or PR reforms. So in the context of like fast fashion companies, for example, that would be either actually truly making their businesses more sustainable, implementing some sort of regulations, monitoring of how their factories work, what the chain of command is, how the employees are treated. And PR reform would be forms of greenwashing, a lot of publicity stunts that don't actually fundamentally change the way that the business operates. So these are the options of actions that an institutional organization might have. And on the other hand, we have another stakeholder, which is the public. So the public can either support the action that is being taken, or they can resist the action that is being taken. So in terms of how this would play out, you might have seen tables like this. It's more or less game theory. So what happens if a person does this or that, and depending on whose action is first can actually change the way that we read this table. So the ideal scenario for a company or an institution would be that they don't spend a lot of money, time, resources on actually changing the way that the company's business operates, but that the public doesn't catch on to it, and that they actually support or continue supporting or even amplify their support for said business. So this would result in very few resources used up, and this would potentially even amplify the amount of resources that the companies have. What the worst possible scenario is probably that the companies have to do a lot of legwork, invest a bunch of money into actually fundamentally changing their structures, and then that would result in the public feeling as if they have the power to change the way that the business operates, and that therefore might create larger demands in the future. Then we have two sort of semi-bad outcomes, which is that you have cheap PR reforms that are being implemented, but the public catches on to it, and there's a lot of resistance to it. People might be boycotting, which might result in losses. So that would therefore nullify the financial potential benefits that would have been attained, or that you have expensive real reforms that are being implemented and that the public doesn't really react in a way that registers that they're now an active agent capable of guiding the business, but that they just continue supporting or support the business more because they see that it is ethical and that matters to them. So from the point of view of the company, if we're talking about what the company is more likely to do, we have to answer to two main questions. The first is how much likelier is outcome X as opposed to outcome Y? In this scenario, how much more likely is it that the public catches on to PR reform as opposed to that they don't? And then that would either cause for them to risk and sort of attempt to only do PR reforms in order to save money. But if you think that the public is really, really likely to sort of monitor their behaviors, then they might not be able to do it. And the second thing is how willing is the actor, the stakeholder, to risk making the wrong decision. And here, with the risk part, we're moving on to a second sort of subsection of trying to understand the incentives of their stakeholder better, which is risk aversiveness. So risk aversiveness is associated with a stakeholder's behaviors in unpredictable circumstances, situations that they might have not been in before. So to do this, you need to identify the context in which they operate. Here, we have three different sections, types of environments. The first is a safe environment, as in they're not under threat. There's no brewing PR scandal. There's no, not a lot of media reporting on potential human rights abuses that are happening in the H&M factories and whatever else. And here, you may not be super certain about whether a stakeholder is going to be risk averse or risk taken. I guess it depends on the surrounding circumstances or the extent of the motivation that the stakeholder has to achieve something. Say, if they're in a financially dire situation, if they really want to save money in order to keep their profit margins, they might be willing to risk it. But if they're already kind of if they've been down this road before, even if they're safe now, they might not be too willing to repeat the same mistakes or risk repeating the same mistakes. If an environment is fragile, on the other hand, where you're not 100% sure what the outcome of the situation is going to be, stakeholders tend to be a little bit more risk averse. This is related to, I suppose you could talk about human nature and the fact that we really care about self-preservation and that we tend to be a little bit more careful when we have a lot to lose. But the third scenario is a context in which a stakeholder has absolutely nothing to lose, as in they know that even if the public catches on and there's massive backlash, which is the worst case scenario, probably they would go bankrupt. And if you go bankrupt anyways, then it's completely fine for you to be willing to take that risk. And we're going to go through an example that's a little bit more intuitive because, those big firms aren't really on the brink of bankruptcy, which shows this nothing to lose mentality that someone might have. A second question that you might want to ask yourself to guide better understanding how how risk averse your stakeholder is to talk about their rationality, as in when you break the matrix down, how likely is it that the stakeholder will genuinely stick to the most plausible outcome in their minds, or how likely is it that they're not going to just make an unpredictable decision because of the way that they're feeling, for example. Because international relations especially, we tend to rely a lot on game theory arguments, but in reality, a lot of international relations decisions are incredibly subjective and based on how we feel about certain countries or certain politicians even that we continue seeing at summits, meetings, and whatever else. Think about Eurovision, right? It's not very, it doesn't necessarily objectively evaluate the quality of the music that is being presented. And here you have to probably look at the historical examples of how said stakeholder had acted beforehand. This requires technology, you having read up on the stakeholder before, being aware of the situation that they are operating in, like especially if it's related to, I don't know, US interventions in the past. What have they done? What are they doing differently now? Or specific politicians' track record, what do they do given certain pressurizing situations? And you can also have a more cookie cutter type analysis, which is just generally, if you know how to run IR arguments, or if you know how to run social justice arguments, then you might want to try and apply that analysis into a more specific scenario, which relates to a specific country, specific social justice movement. But here, there's really not much to do from an analytical point of view. It has to be fed by also your general knowledge and your capacity to attend workshops, say, that have to do with matter prep. Right. So an example of doing the sort of risk and aversiveness analysis is Extinction Rebellion, which is a social justice movement that is associated with the goal of combating climate change, and they usually employ strategies that are seen by a lot of people, especially in terms of damaging infrastructure to create, amplify pressure for either politicians or firms to change the way that they operate. So this is they're grassroots movements, but they don't aim for public support. They more so rely on being powerful enough in their actions in order to be able to guide policy, whether it be state or private. So in the context of this sort of analysis, we know that Extinction Rebellion activists likely have a point of view that they are in an environment where they have absolutely nothing to lose. They're not feeling safe because climate change is obviously, they feel the effects of climate change. They understand that they're so soon going to be reaching a point of no return. They also furthermore see that not much is changing. Furthermore, they're not reliant on widespread public support. Therefore, they don't need to be very careful about what the actions that they take look to someone who is moderate or unaware of why they do the things that they do. But then furthermore, in weaving in more spec knowledge, we know that just because someone has nothing to lose, it doesn't mean that they do absolutely anything and see what sticks. Extinction Rebellion activists still take very calculated action in the sense that they target infrastructure that they know could potentially cause some actual real life policy change. And they also make sure to limit the damage that is caused to the civilians, to the people that, say, live next to some sort of a pipeline. They furthermore do actions separate of ecoterrorism. For example, during COVID, I think they had a lot of operations to help citizens sort of connect, to help their mental health, to help their access to things like education, food, water, and whatever else. So yeah, risk aversiveness is another thing that you definitely have to consider. And the third, which is, I suppose, the one that most people already intuitively fall to when they do stakeholder analysis, is the identity and the values, as in the theoretical background behind which someone operates. These things are sometimes very pronounced. Sometimes they're a little bit more subconscious/intuitive. If we're talking about social justice movements, probably they have some sort of a manifesto where they very much so detail what it is that they care about. But if it's an average Joe individual, one, they might not be able to articulate what it is that they believe in, and two, even if they can, often there's a sort of dual track of experiences where in a specific environment they might be guided by some principles, and in another one by others. Think side-B Christians and whatever else. So questions that you could ask yourself to guide this sort of analysis are, what are the underlying principles, doctrines that the stakeholder is guided by? And here, if you're completely unaware, you think about what past actions the stakeholder has taken, and you try to reverse engineer what might have been the underlying principle behind them. So you trust the way that these people present themselves, or you trust that if they have done this in the past, they're likely to do a similar thing in the future, depending on how rational they are. And then a second question could be, what are some non-negotiables? What are some red lines? So, for instance, what is a trade-off that a social justice movement can and should make, and what is something that is absolutely not supposed to be touched? And here we can also think about whether a stakeholder is generally principled, as in consistent, or if they're performative, easily affected by outside factors, outside agents, whether they succumb to pressure easily. Yeah, and this also refers to this dual track of experiences when we may not be super consistent with the way that we apply what we believe in practice. So for social justice movements, which is, I suppose, an easier way to put this analysis into practice, we think about the size as well as the location of where they operate. And depending on the goals, they might be a little bit more radical, unwilling to compromise, or a little bit more willing to sort of appeal to the masses in order to be able to garner public support or to be able to push policy forward. So you have to think about whether a specific movement, say, like a subsection of the LGBTI movement in Lithuania that participates in Vilnius Pride, whether they're likely to self-censor or whether they're willing to show up in drag, for example, which is likely to generate a lot of public backlash from more moderate audiences. So it's outcome versus principle consistency. You weigh those two against each other. Also, this ties back to our risk aversiveness analysis. If you identify and characterize that a stakeholder is in a nothing to lose scenario, or if they perceive their situation as nothing to lose, then probably they are more likely to be applying their principles consistently and willing to alienate, for instance, moderate audiences in order to be able to at least say to themselves that they stay true to what it was that they believed in, which is, say, capacity to self-reflect. And to those types of movements or those types of individuals, self-censorship would be a red line that they would not be willing to cross in their actions. And it would be like fundamentally opposed to the goals of the movement or to the way that they want to present themselves and express their identity. Cool. So that was the incentives part of analysis questions that you could ask yourself. And now we're moving on to capacity. So here, the very intuitively key question is, can your stakeholder actually get things done? And here we think about, first of all, resources. We sort of move away from the stakeholder themselves and think about the impact of the argument and ask ourselves what kind of resource is needed in order to carry out the motivation that was established in order to achieve said impact. So sometimes that's going to be parallel for both sides of the house. It can be financial resources, capacity to get elected, widespread public support, yada, yada. But sometimes those can be different depending on which stakeholder exactly it is that you're talking about. So for someone, it might be, if it's someone who's extremely well off, they might only need financial resources in order to be able to exert some sort of power over political processes, democratic processes that are moving forward. But if you're a community, if you're some sort of a movement, then you might instead, because you don't have those resources, need some sort of public support. So the general types of resources that you could be thinking about are: one, material wealth. So think money, property, shares in some sort of a company. Then two, institutional framework. Do you have the mandate to do something? Can you get the mandate to do something? Is what it is that you're doing actually legal? can you be protected by someone if they end up attacking you, opposing you because of the decisions that you make? And then we have soft influence, which is more difficult to quantify and to be able to to confidently say that you do have that. So think popularity. It can either be depth of popularity, as in the people that like you really, really like you and they're willing to stand behind you no matter what, or it can be the scope of your popularity, as in more or less, no matter what side of the political spectrum, what sort of community someone goes through, as a part of how they identify, they're likely to somewhat support you, even if they're not willing to die for you. And it's also reach, as well as credibility. How likely is someone to believe you when you tell them something? Yeah. And then we have to do comparative analysis here between agents and sides to determine who actually has more of said resources in order to be able to achieve the impact. So here, what I want to draw your attention to is that fiat is incredibly important. So especially in terms of policy, if a policy limits action to something very specific as opposed to keeping it widespread, then it probably presumes some sort of a reallocation of resources. So think about there was a motion on tests or admissions procedures for universities. And the motion was framed in a way as to whether this House supports the exclusive use of standardized testing, quantifiable testing and admissions procedures, as opposed to essays, interviews, and whatever else. So the way that proposition in that debate, I think it was Tokyo IV, don't remember which year, the way that it was David Africa, the way that they phrased it was that because this House supports the exclusive use of quantifiable standardized testing, that presumes automatically that since more attention is going to be on these types of tests, say nationwide, since that is the thing that determines whether your child or your student gets into an Ivy League school, there's going to be more pressure over ensuring that that these tests are actually fair, that they're meritocratic, that they're able to properly, truly show that these individuals, when they take those tests, are going to be accurately represented. So this is not the case in opposition. And opposition might argue that, oh, these tests, they're specific companies, big companies that organize them, and they're not very well monitored. There's not a lot of attention on them, not a lot of transparency, and so therefore they're not very accurate, not a very reliable method for identifying whether someone is good enough. So proposition, if they come up and the first thing that they say is this, they immediately sort of outframe opposition because they provide a specific context in which the debate takes place, which is already different from the worst case scenario that opposition outlines. So this is incredibly important. And in a lot of debates, both in opposition and in proposition, you have to think about how fiat affects the allocation of resources or the extent of, say, attention, financial aid that someone or something receives. So this would be an example of a sort of comparative analysis that you could do between stakeholders in a debate about military agreements. So you can think about peacekeeping or training for national armies to increase their capacities or their qualifications. So you can break the comparative analysis of one's resources into material wealth, institutional framework, and soft influence. So for bilateral military agreements, that is to say between two countries, you have probably more access to material wealth than you would under multilateral military agreements. So think about UN peacekeeping missions, which are chronically underfunded. And also the amount of resources that is being allocated heavily depends on consensus of the parties that are within that multilateral organization. So therefore, funding is not only likely to be less, but it's also likely to be a little bit more volatile. However, for bilateral military agreements, if a country is motivated enough to send their soldiers, their coaches, trainers, whatever else, they probably have some sort of financial incentives behind it. Say, we give you this, we give you a good discount, but as a consequence, we do a little bit more trade. You give us some sort of privileges in accessing your natural resources. And so therefore, you're likely to have access to more material wealth. Notice that when I'm breaking this analysis down, I'm already weaving in responses to questions relating to the incentives as in motivations of different stakeholders. So we assume that consensus is very important for multilateral organizations, and we also assume that there's a certain financial incentive behind countries engaging with some militaries bilaterally. If we think about the institutional framework and the resources that a recipient country, say, might have in keeping checks and balances on their partners, we can think that it's probably more efficient getting things done if you're only dealing with a single country's bureaucracy, but there are also fewer checks and balances. You might not be able to access, like there are no internal built-in mechanisms for verifying whether, the deals that are being made are transparent, whether there are no human rights abuses involved, who actually monitors the outcome, the implementation of the agreement, are all questions that you may not have access to. And comparatively, you have multilateral agreements that, sure, the decision-making might be a little bit more politicized because you have consensus that needs to be built in order to get something done. It's also likely to be more bureaucratic, but probably there are also more checks and balances. There are like special rapporteurs that go in and they check on the situation. They write these big reports that are then being publicized. And so you have more motivation to stick to international humanitarian law, for instance. And as opposed to soft influence, you have to think about the perspectives, the extent to which a specific stakeholder is able to guide the way that they're being perceived and how they're already being perceived. So what are the sort of, what is the real life situation that they're dealing with? What sort of context are they stepping in? How are they vulnerable? So if it's a bilateral agreement, depending on who it is, if it's like France and Africa, for example, it's probably going to be perceived as neo-colonial. But if it's like Russia setting Africa core, then it's more likely to be seen as a counterweight to neocolonialism and as a way of like liberating your country. As for multilateral military agreements, oftentimes you have more regional ownership, especially if it's a regional organization with their own, say, peacekeeping forces that are active. So you have less foreign interference, but if it's a massive organization such as UN, it can also be perceived as more biased towards the rhetoric of the West. So you have to weigh all of those bits and pieces of analysis out against each other. Think about what is more important for executing the goal. So if it's pure military capacity that you care about, you can talk about material wealth only. But if you're trying to counterweigh the fact that probably if you have a bilateral military agreement, you're more likely to have access to more money, as the side that defends UN-type interventions, you probably will be thinking more about checks and balances and the importance of having that and how things could go wrong. So it's important to break this down not only for the stakeholder that you're mainly focusing on or the stakeholder that is writing impacts for you, but also for the stakeholder that your opponents are going to be using for the very same reason. So comparative is incredibly crucial. And then the last bit is constraints. So the first bit is structural constraints. In other words, there are some things that you're highly unlikely to overcome. So there are some things that the stakeholder cannot change physically because they don't depend on them. There are also some things or impacts, actions that are highly costly and therefore unlikely to be taken because, for example, you have limited financial resources. And there might also be alternative competing goals, impacts, interests where resources are to be put. And therefore, even if you technically have them, you might not be as motivated to use them in the context of the debate. So constraints are very important because once again, they bring the debate to a more realistic scenario where you're not just in debate land looking at things on paper. And then you have self-imposed, more strategically placed constraints So alternative goals was supposed to be under self-imposed. Apologies for that. And then another thing you might think about is the spillover benefits of taking a specific desirable action in the context of this debate. This is especially important if you can, while achieving something that is desirable, virtue signal that you're being principally consistent, or that you're, behind a specific actor group, and that is going to cause for you to have more soft power, more influence, more likely to have a mandate in the next 4 years. This specific spillover benefits part, I want to note that it's incredibly useful for coming up with third arguments for second speakers, because usually we're thinking about the immediate capacities and motivations to get something done. But if you're thinking of more like wacky arguments, they're going to be like the logically prior argument is going to be the one that you presented beforehand, since if you don't achieve the impacts, you're not going to achieve the spillover impacts of this either. But they can be good if you're lacking ideas, or if you're really confident that you're actually able to achieve this sort of impact. So an example of this type of rhetoric thinking that you could go through with your teammates while you're building a case is any sort of debate on sanctioning entities, authoritarian entities, say like we had in the championship last winter. So when you think about the sanctioning stakeholders, say the European Union or a specific state, you have to think about the constraint of having that sanctions package actually pass through the formal procedures. That's something that usually cannot be overcome. So therefore, you need political consensus unavoidably. If you need political consensus, a self-imposed constraint as a consequence of that might be the fear of alienating a part of your either electorate or a member state that is a part of your organization. Furthermore, another constraint might be fear of economic repercussions. So that's more self-imposed. A more structural constraint might be the difficulty of achieving economic independence in the short term. And then another constraint that might be a little bit more self-imposed is the willingness to keep channels of communication open if you want to change the behavior of a specific country. And this also relates to risk aversiveness. To what extent do you actually believe that if you're able to keep those channels of communication open, you will be able to influence or direct their behavior? Or maybe if it's a sort of nothing to lose scenario, or if it's highly risky, you would just rather be willing to take the step that in the short term might cause some repercussions, but in the long term might be more beneficial. As per sanctioned entities, some examples of constraints that they might be facing are reputational damage, the fear of economic isolation, and the desire to keep one's elites happy in order to keep oneself afloat as a leader of a specific regime. So those are more self-imposed constraints, since the debate is likely to take place from the perspective of the sanctioning entity. So you're thinking about the consequences or the reactions from the sanctioned state. So in the game theory table, the first thing that you need to think about is the pragmatic action to be taken, and then you theorize on the potential reactions. And as per civilians, a structural constraint in this context would be the lack of agency capacity to change something, understanding that you are going to suffer because someone imposed sanctions on your country, even if you don't agree with it. And then another structural constraint would be the high vulnerability that you're exposed to, given your lack of agency. So now the last part of the workshop is a short discussion on the strategic importance of going through incentive capacity analysis, either in your prep or very explicitly in your argumentation. So you can create arguments where you prove that a stakeholder has the capacity to do something, but if you don't prove that they have the incentive, the motivation to do it, your impact is not going to be attained, since you don't actually justify why the impact is going to be achieved, why the action is going to be taken. So examples of this would be big tech debates where you talk about enforcing some sort of regulations. So we know that they probably have enough resources, financial, institutional, to enforce those regulations on the content of their platforms. But if you don't prove that they have the incentive to do so, you're not going to win the debate, since the most intuitive answer that your opponents could come up with is that such action would not be aligned with a profit-oriented mindset. They prove that the incentive is actually counter to the assumption that you're making the argument with. So therefore, cool, they have the capacity, but you don't have the argument in your pocket. Same thing with proving incentive, but not proving capacity. So an example of this is social justice movements. They might want for marginalized communities to have their right to be legally protected by the state, and they might be incredibly motivated to do so. But if you don't prove that they're going to have institutional access or that they're going to have widespread support, you're not able to prove that they're going to be likely to succeed in whatever lobbying efforts it is that they're trying to that they're doing. So aside from those two examples, and in a more broader sense, to close this up, comparative analysis is incredibly important through the lens of incentives, capacities. Both of them have to be covered in analysis. We're already aware of this, but the bad thing about it is that in refutation, in engagement with another's arguments, you don't actually have to disprove both of those for the argument to fail. As long as you prove that someone doesn't have the incentive to do it, even if they have the money, the argument is not going to stand. As long as you prove that they don't have the resources to do it, even if they really want to, the argument doesn't stand. Therefore, you have to be very strategic about the ways in which you refute arguments. You don't have to target them in their entirety. You have to target a very crucial link that causes for the impact to actually be attainable. So even if your opponent's argument is analytically sound, even if both of those parts are there, one of them might not be good enough. One of them might not be as charitable to the actual fabric of the way that the world works or whatever else. So with this in consideration, the last sort of comment that I leave you with is that from agent capacity and motivation analysis on out, it's mostly either about disproving or weighing, as in which scenario is much more likely. If you have two sides of the house describing a stakeholder in radically different ways, explaining that they have entirely different drives in order to do something, you have to sort of weigh which one of those scenarios is much more likely to happen, given past historical examples, given, pure theoretical analysis on someone's values, points of view, on the pressures, external circumstances that they're facing, and whatever else. So yeah, characterizations, TLDR, are incredibly important. They're also a lot more intuitive than building an argument from scratch about something that you might not understand completely. So I suggest humanizing debates as much as possible in order to be able to attain a sort of analytically sound and realistic argument. This is not a foolproof method. This is one of the ways in which people can debate. I'm willing to die on the hill that, motivation, capacity, analysis is important and should be had in every single debate, but how explicit it is and how fundamental it is to the specific argument that you're building is obviously up to you. This is something for you to be able to try out, see if it sticks, and if it doesn't, just move on and look for something else. Yep, that was it. Thank you.